Welcome to July 1st, 2026 Landmarks Board meeting. It's 6:03 p.m. Marcy, will you review the virtual meeting decorum?
Yes. The city has engaged with community members to co-create a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations. This vision supports physical and emotional safety for community members, staff, and board and commission members, as well as democracy for people of all ages, identities, lived experiences, and political perspectives. More about this vision and the project's community engagement process can be found online. The following are examples of rules of decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support this vision. They'll be upheld during this meeting. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behaviors that disrupt or otherwise impede the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited, and participants may raise their hand to speak during open comment and public comment periods during hearings. Individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. Currently, only audio testimony is permitted online. And for those of us joining online, the raise hand function can be found in the reaction menu with some shortcuts shown on the screen. Thank you.
Great, thanks. The recording of this meeting will be available in the records archive on the YouTube within 28 days of the meeting. We will do a roll call vote and brief introductions. Michael.
Michael Ray, Vice Chair, Landmarks Board.
John.
John Decker, member of the Landmarks Board.
Alex.
Alex Weinheimer, member.
Is Chelsea
Oh,
virtual?
hi.
Hi.
Hi. Chelsea Castellano, Landmarks Board member.
Sorry, Chelsea, I didn't see your face up there, so I didn't know if you were there. So, hi. I'm Renee Globik, Chair of the Landmarks Board. We have a quorum this evening. We know that people who are here to participate may have some strong feelings about these projects. We want to hear from you and found it's more proactive if you are speaking to persuade us rather than to berate us, staff, or the applicant. As with the regular Landmarks Board meetings, you may only speak at the appropriate time during the public hearing. Requests to speak outside of these times are denied. We request the members of the public who wish to speak let us know by raising their virtual hand or talk to Mariah. As the board chair, I will call for a roll call vote on any motions made. Does anyone have any changes or alterations to the June 3rd minutes? As I see none, I don't think I can make a motion, can I? Because I wasn't here. Okay.
I make a motion to approve the meeting minutes from the June board meeting hearing.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Thanks, John. Thanks. We'll do a roll call. Michael.
Aye.
John.
Aye.
Alex.
Aye.
We'll now move to public participation for non-agenda items. This is to speak to topics other than the public hearings. As a reminder, we no longer are swearing people in for the open comment. Mariah, do we have any virtual attendees?
If you'd like to speak to this, oh, we've got one, Lynn Siegel. Lynn, it looks like you're muted.
I really don't think that you people understand, and I'm sorry that if this is uncomfortable to you for you to hear, but it's the facts. And that is, you're not on the Housing Advisory Board. You're not on the Planning Board. If you want to be on those boards, you can apply for them. But you ought not be determining where senior housing should be in Boulder, pushed by low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC funds from the federal government, to benefit seniors at the expense of for every unit of senior housing, you get 10 units of market housing that prices everyone in Boulder out of housing and puts us in this affordable dilemma that we have. But that isn't your business, is it? Your business is preserving landmarked properties, like you're doing too tonight. And your business is preserving those buildings and those sweet little bungalows like across from the library for the rest of this community to have some faint memory of what this town used to be. And that's very important because, I'm an ultrasound technologist. The visual is everything to me. The visual for people in this field of architecture and landmarking is everything. Everything. You never will know what was here if it's scraped and if it's replaced. All in the name of the benefit, the false benefit of senior housing. And if you don't know this, you ought to spend some time at planning board meetings and HAB meetings. I can't cover the HAB meetings because they conflict with other board meetings that I do follow, which is RAB and OSBT and TAB and planning board and your board. So please think about it because, your legacy on this board is very important. And if you aren't really supposed to be on this board, maybe you ought to choose another one. Because that decision and those logistics going down from 3 to 1 were very critical in land use mapping and what Boulder's future is going to be. So think carefully and deeply about where you actually are sitting. Done.
Thank you, Lynn. Mariah, do we have any in-person or virtual?
No more.
No more. Thanks. Marcy, do we have any pending applications for discussion of the demolition applications issued or pending?
We do not.
Great. We'll move on to our first hearing. This is a public hearing and consideration of an application to designate the property at 1004 Lincoln Place as an individual landmark pursuant to section 911.5 of the Boulder Revised Code of 1981. And under the precedes prescribed by chapter 1 through 3 quasi-judicial hearings, the Boulder Revised Code of 1981. The owner and applicant, Valerie Stova, I'll hand it over to Claire for the staff presentation.
Thank you, Renee. This is a quasi-judicial hearing, so everybody speaking will be sworn in. That includes me. I'm Claire Brandt. I'm Historic Preservation Planner, and I affirm that I will tell the truth. I'll pause briefly to allow board members to note any ex parte contacts.
I made a brief site visit this evening and looked at the house from the sidewalk in the public alley.
Okay, thank you, Alex. I'm assuming, Chris, that we don't need to cure that ex parte contact.
Good evening, everyone. That's accurate. It's always good to note for the record if you visit the site as an ex parte, but I don't have concerns that that's going to impact your partiality. But board members get to decide if there's something going on that they need to disclose that might impact their partiality. So if you're conducting a site visit and like the owner comes out and talks to you, then we need to discuss that. But just simply viewing the house, it's good to disclose, but per a normal course, I'm not going to engage in a colloquy to see if that has impacted whether or not you can be impartial.
Great, thank you. I'll be doing a presentation today, and after I've presented to the board, the applicant will have up to 10 minutes to also present to the board. and then we'll open the public hearing. After all members of the public have made comments, the applicant may respond to anything that was said, and then the board will deliberate. And a motion today requires an affirmative vote of at least 3 members to pass, and the motion will state findings, conclusions, and a recommendation. A record of this hearing is available in a couple of days as a video recording, and the official record is added to the records archive, usually within 28 days. The criteria for review is outlined in the Boulder Revised Code under 911(5)(c). The application came from the owner of the property in April, and I'd like to introduce Valerie. She is here tonight. Hearing should be scheduled between 60 and 120 days of an accepted application. So that's what brings us here today. And the options today are for the Landmarks Board to approve the application and recommend designation to City Council. The council hearing would be held within 100 days, or the board may disapprove the request, and this is subject to a 45-day call-up period, and the owner, if they disagree, would need to file a notice of appeal within 21 days of today. So this is our first property. It's at 1004 Lincoln Place. It's on the northeast corner of Lincoln and Euclid Avenue in the University Hill neighborhood. The property is within the potential University Hill Historic District, which, when it was identified in 1992, was potentially eligible as a National Register Historic District, with 1004 Lincoln Place identified as a contributing feature of the proposed district. The district was never designated. However, the house was surveyed in 1990 and 2001 and found to be itself eligible for the National Register as, and this is a quote, "It is an exceptionally good example of craftsman-style architecture in Boulder. The house also has Tudor Revival influences seen in the stucco and half timbering, which cover the entire second story. The building also features a bay window, an oriel window, and several multi-pane windows. Craftsman-style homes were popular in Colorado in the early part of the 20th century, although many bungalow/craftsman-style homes can be found in Boulder's University Hill neighborhood. This building is one of the largest and best examples." The house was built in 1908 by the Beard family. Julia and James Beard lived in Fort Worth, Texas. Julia's brother organized the Texas and Colorado Railway Improvement Company, which brought the railroad and the Texas-Colorado Chautauqua to Boulder. Julia and James gained enormous wealth through the railroads. They were attracted to Boulder because of the easy rail connections back to their family in Texas. They also hoped that Boulder's mountain air would be a healthy location for their son Edwin, who suffered from tuberculosis. And it's likely that they included the large craftsman-style front porch and sleeping porch, which you might be able to see here at just at the rear, to help Edwin's condition. This is a map of the neighborhood, approximately when Julia and James purchased the property. You might be able to make out the faint red pencil line that shows the streetcar route. The streetcar was built for the Texas-Colorado Chautauqua and increased the desirability of lots in this area. The Denver and Boulder Land and Investment Company, which sold the lots to Julia and James, placed a restriction on the lots. They held that all dwellings shall be built of brick or brick and stone combined. This is the west side facing Lincoln Place. You can see the brick and stone that had to be used to build the house, including the massive stone lintel over the front door. The Tudor Revival influences are in the half timbering on the second level and the gable end of the front porch. There's also an oriel window, which is, it's a little bit hard to see, but it's the slight projection at the center of the top level that has decorative brackets underneath and a trio of stucco panels with detailing in the inside corners, which make the stucco look like it's a circle. And this is the south side facing Euclid. You can see other elements typical of the craftsman style. The exposed rafter ends, overhanging eaves, chunky porch elements with paired porch columns, and windows with divided lights in the upper sash and a single light in the lower sash. Some craftsman houses display a small amount of half timbering, but this one is kind of a blend of the two styles, as the entire upper level is decorative timber and stucco. The Tudor Revival aspect of the house is executed with great detail. The windows fit perfectly within the spaces created by the beams, and if you look closely, you'll see that there are details like curved timbers. The south end of the front porch was enclosed, we think in 1923, but sometime between 1909 and 1929. Around that time and through the Great Depression and subsequent Second World War, multiple families lived in this house, and the enclosed porch gave them a little more living space. They enclosed the porch without modifying the craftsman detailing, however. Mildred Bemis's parents bought the house after the Second World War. They added a frame addition at the rear, which also added to the rentable space in the house for the multiple families that lived there. They also remodeled the interior to create 3 self-contained apartments with kitchens, one in the basement, one on the first floor, and a third on the second floor. And before this remodel, one of the residents cooked for all of the families living in the house. In addition, the rent might have included kitchen privileges for those who wanted to cook for themselves. This is the north side of the house with a secondary entrance near the rear. You can also see the layers of stone foundation brick and stucco and half timbering in the upper levels. There's another oriel window, even on this relatively private side of the house, demonstrating the care and detail from the architect. The property also includes a brick accessory building with stucco and half timbering and craftsman detailing. The original owners, Julia and James Beard, likely commissioned this building at the same time. They had at least one car, and the building was constructed under the same rules of stone and brick. Staff analysis uses the Landmarks Board 1975 significance criteria and also the National Park Service aspects of integrity to ensure the building retains the physical features that allow it to convey the significance. Staff found that the house meets the criteria for both significance and integrity. The house has changed over time as residents adapted it to their needs, but all of the changes have been completed with sensitivity to the house, and you can still recognize it from its original construction. The property has had a number of stewards over the last 118 years. The longest and current owners, the Stoiver family, purchased the house in 1971. Jane Stoiver ran the Wardenberg Student Health Center at the university, working first as a psychotherapist and later as director of clinical social work. Johann Stoiver quickly became one of the foremost researchers into biofeedback, doing groundbreaking research in what was called alternative medicine. He studied sleep and stress-related disease and oversaw the science of biofeedback becoming recognized in healthcare. The 1990 survey considered the house eligible for inclusion on the National Register based on the high artistic values and significance as an exceptionally good example of craftsman-style architecture in Boulder. The craftsman-style architecture emerged from the arts and crafts movement of the early 20th century and stressed comfort and utility through the use of natural materials and a lack of pretension. Staff agrees that although we are unable to confirm the architect, this is one of Boulder's best examples of craftsman and Tudor Revival style and was completed with great skill. The rail connection between Fort Worth and Colorado was a key factor in the development of the Texas-Colorado Chautauqua and also the neighborhood. About 1/4 of all lots in the University Place neighborhood were developed between the arrival of the Chautauqua and 1910. And while the primary facade faces west towards Lincoln Place, the design includes prominent features on the south elevation that create a secondary facade facing Euclid Avenue. The orientation and prominence of the house creates a familiar visual landmark within the neighborhood and tells the story of the area's early development. Staff recommends the property be known as the Beard Stoiver House to recognize the property's first owners, Julia and James Beard, and prominent long-term residents, Johann and Jane Stoiver, and the Stoiver family's stewardship of the property for the last 55 years. The boundary would follow the property lines of the lot, and this boundary is supported by the property owner. So staff recommends to the Landmarks Board that you adopt the findings in the memo and recommend to City Council that it designate the property at 1004 Lincoln Place as a local historic landmark to be known as the Beard Stoiver House, finding that it meets the standards for individual landmark designation in sections 911.1 and 911.2, Boulder Revised Code 1981. Staff's findings are that the designation will protect, enhance, and perpetuate a property reminiscent of a past era of history and preserve an important example of Boulder's historic architecture. The proposed designation will maintain an appropriate setting and environment for the building and enhance property values, stabilize the neighborhood, promote tourist trade and interest, and foster knowledge of the city's living heritage. That's the end of the staff presentation. This is a reminder of the next steps. We'll ask Valerie if she has anything to add, and then we'll move on to public participation and then board deliberation. And the options today are for the Landmarks Board to approve the application and recommend designation to City Council or recommend denial. Any questions for staff?
I have a question. So when it was used like for lots of families, did you find out like it was obviously before the Stova family bought it, but was there like 3 families living in the house, or was it like quite a bit? Like it was an apartment building, or it was more or less they knew each other?
They didn't know each other all the time. There was some interesting dynamics during the Depression years when there were multiple families moving in and out of the property. I think it just supported 3 families at one time, but we don't know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we can move on to the owner applicant if she would like to speak.
Welcome, Valerie.
And I think we still swear, right? Yes. So please state your full name and swear to tell the truth.
Okay, my name is Valerie Stoiva, and I swear to tell the truth. Okay. And thank you for the highly informative presentation. I just have really enjoyed learning my home's history. I guess is this carrying all right? Is it supposed to be that far away? Oh, okay. And I did just want to make one minor correction, though. But my mother was the director of clinical social work, so she loved her job and her position, and she was the director of social work. Okay, so I wrote in advance, and of course, good evening. I think it was just last week in the New York Times, I was reading. Preservation demonstrates, quote, a belief in the worth and beauty of the old and a possibility of repairing, even resurrecting stones and spirits alike, unquote. I'm seeking landmark status for my family home, 1004 Lincoln Place. The artful structure has a peaceful and melancholy air. Landmark status would indicate the worth not only of the house, but of the neighborhood, Uni Hill, always changing and in flux. It would also confer the practical benefit of better enabling maintenance and upkeep. To me, the house has always been a place of learning filled with books and papers, and during my lifetimes, my parents' lifetimes, parties and gatherings of academics. I was fascinated to learn of the first owners' association with railroads and the Chautauqua movement. I was surprised that there was never a horse and always a car or maybe cars in the accessory building. I mean, I'd even taken to calling it the carriage house. So Tennefer Lincoln seems to have a very rich history in and of itself, and its context is a historic and important Boulder neighborhood. So thank you for your time. Should I turn it off?
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. Now we can move to public comment. Virtual attendees, please raise your hand or press *9 if you'd like to speak. And Mariah, do we have any in-person or virtual people to speak?
Yes, we've got 2 in person. First up is Tim Plass.
A little up for me. My name is Tim Plass. I'm Executive Director of Historic Boulder, and I swear to tell the truth in my testimony this evening. And I'm so pleased to be here tonight to actually speak to 2 owner-initiated designations. And I hope that you will move this designation request forward to City Council to become a landmark. On the merits, the architecture I think is clear, and I love the way that it was described in the plaque that's going to go on this building. Tudor revival with a craftsman twist, which I think is very appropriate. And also it has great association with the Beards and the Stoivas. And I just met Valerie for the first time tonight, but I knew Jane Stoiva when I was a council member. Jane was on the University Hill Neighborhood Association and a fierce advocate for Uni Hill. So there's a personal part of this for me. I'm so glad to see this house moving forward. And I think, again, I was just really taken with the story that came out about the house, and not just the architecture, but the people who live there. And it just makes it so rich. And I think that's one of the great benefits. And Claire, thank you for really digging deep to landmarking your house. And finally, I just want to thank Valerie for bringing this forward. It truly is a worthy house, and I hope the application moves forward. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Catherine Barth.
I live in North Boulder, but for some reason, my path around town takes me by this corner a lot. And one of the things that I have found so interesting over the years is the way that the porch kind of wraps that corner. And I think of that when I go by, and I just think it's a lovely detail. And it's it would be just a small, ordinary front porch if it didn't have this wrapping. And so I just have always thought, gosh, this is so interesting. And now I find that it's being acknowledged and landmarked. So I want to thank the owners and encourage you to support this landmarking and send it on to City Council. Thank you.
Catherine, will you state your full name?
Oh,
and swear to tell the
Catherine
truth?
Do you want my address?
No,
Or you
just
don't do
swear-
that anymore?
Just
Okay.
swear to tell us the truth.
I did. I will. I have. I have told you the truth. Okay, thank you.
Do we have any virtual attendees?
Yes, we've got 1. Lynn Siegel.
Lynn, you will have 3 minutes. Please state your full name and swear to tell the truth.
Yeah. I wish I could have seen Valerie because I knew her mom. And this house really reminds me a lot of Judy Reed and Richard Collins' place on Mapleton and 6th. It's probably kind of a twin house to this one. And of course, it should be landmarked and they should be able to access the historic preservation funds to recover any losses from, you know, restoring it. And let's see. Oh, I appreciate the correction of the director of clinical social work, and the biofeedback, kind of old school terminology, but relevant, particularly to Palestine today. Free Palestine and preserve this house, preserve the Gazans along with it. And my friend across the street diagonally, Isabel. So I see the house not infrequently and glad to see that the family's carrying on after Jane has left us. And I just appreciate this architecture and that they could come upon it and appreciate it beyond the beards into the future. And now maybe it will go either onwards into their family or others that can appreciate the benefit of the historic landmarking status. Thanks.
Lynn, will you state your full name and swear to
Lynn,
tell the truth?
Lynn Siegel, and I swear to tell the truth, but only the truth as I know it. I can't ascertain it's some universal truth, just my truth. Is that okay with you?
It's okay with me. Thank you.
Thanks.
The owner may now have additional 3 minutes if they would like to comment with anything said.
I just appreciate the feedback. I've always been told it's a nice house. So thank you so much. And I do think it would be a shame if it were to, you know, not be preserved. To be sure. Yeah. I mean, and if not, and for other people in the future, as Lynn pointed out. That's the point.
Thank you. So we're now going to move to the board discussions. I ask that everyone else mute your computer or phone for the duration of the discussion. John?
No,
Sorry.
all right, well, no,
go
I'll
ahead.
open.
Okay.
I think that I feel very, I guess, fortunate and honored that this a quality project like this comes before us and is asking for designation. I think it's a beautiful house. There are others like it, but this one's unique. Each one is, and I highly support this petition.
Thanks, John. I do have to say, Valerie, that the house, I mean, it's so great that you are looking to designate your family home and how much love that you already have there and that you've grown up there. And it's really fun to hear, like, being a fly on the wall probably when your parents were, you know, having those parties with all the other faculty. But I did notice that like, Catherine, what you were talking about, that front porch, there's the gable end that faces the side street, you know, something that probably wouldn't have, you know, but someone took great detail on putting the gable end on the opposite side as well, not just to be, you know, a side. They knew it was a corner lot and they knew that those sides were just as important. So it is really interesting to see the house, and thanks for, you know, wanting to designate it, and I hope that you can keep preserving it.
Thank you.
So-
I do too. Preserve it. Yeah, I feel so embarrassed. I guess I shouldn't say this, but the garage hasn't been roofed in the time that I've lived in that house. Okay.
In the
But
future.
I wanted to say too, we had somebody working, a contractor in our house. I think it was in the 80s, and he was on the indoors quite a bit and in the outdoors, and he thought the details were.
Oh, Chris.
I'm just sorry to interrupt. Conversations between, the dais up there, it's not on the record. So if the board wants to talk to anybody, they should come up to the podium. But this is deliberation, so.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
I'm supportive of the staff recommendation and appreciated all the history of who had lived in the home, and it's been cared for wonderfully by a family for 55 years at this point. So yeah, very supportive of designating it as an individual landmark, and hope that helps preserve and restore parts of it, especially with the garage. Looks like it's could use some love, and I hope it gets that.
And I'm okay calling it a carriage house. It looks like a carriage house. That's what I would call it. Can we see the original, the black and white photo? There's a detail while you're finding that. There's a detail at the base of the porch that in the old photograph shows up much clearer, where there are brick arches and then there's a keystone in those brick arches. This is in the base and the foundation of the porch. You see it in the two photographs on the left-hand side, much more clearly on the 1909 image. I presume, and it looks like there's some little impost blocks at the edges of the arches. Are those details there? And there's just like a screen that prevents critters and stuff from going underneath the porch?
They are there.
Okay, because it does look like in the more contemporary photographs, there's some obstruction, I think. So
Do I have to turn this?
it's on.
To answer that question, we had a wheelchair ramp, a wrought iron wheelchair ramp, and my husband took it down piece by piece, and for some reason he put some of the parts in different openings around the base of the house. I don't really know. Maybe I need to have a discussion with him about
I don't
that.
think so.
But it's there.
I'm just asking out of curiosity because that detail looks so prominent in this particular photograph. I mean, there are no trees either,
Right.
but if you go to a more contemporary image, you can see that it's being obstructed by something. And I was
Maybe
curious to know.
greenery too.
I love this house, so thank you very much. I mean, we're indebted to property owners who come forward like yourself to preserve these what I would say great monuments to Boulder and the residential scale for sure. So I'm appreciative. Thank you.
Chelsea, would you like to say anything?
Just that I support the recommendation and thank you to the applicants for coming forward.
Great. Do we want to make a motion?
I will. With motion language. No, there it is. There it is. I move that the Landmarks Board recommends to the City Council that it designate the property at 1004 Lincoln Place as a local historic landmark to be known as the Beard-Stoiva House, finding that it meets the standards for individual landmark designation in sections 9-11-1 and 9-11-2 Boulder Revised Code 1981, and adopt the staff memorandum dated July 1st, 2026 as the findings of the board.
Second the motion.
Thank you, John, for the motion, and thanks, Michael, for the motion. Any additional discussion or amendments? We have none. We'll do a roll call vote. Michael,
Aye.
John,
Aye.
Chelsea, Alex.
Aye.
Sorry, aye.
That's okay. Thanks, Chelsea. Renee, I chose aye. Motion passes unanimously. Claire, could you please go over the next steps?
Yes, we will forward the application to City Council for a review in a public hearing within 100 days. So before October 9th. And City Council are the final decision makers. But hopefully they will approve the designation and then we'll work on the plaque. And I want to thank you for coming tonight. And I would also like to mention that Carolyn Holmes Stepanek, who is sitting right next to you, her great-grandmother at one point, very briefly, owned the lots that your house sits on. So introduce yourselves. So thank you very much for being here today.
So we will move on to the next public hearing. This is a public hearing and consideration of an application to designate the property at 844-850 12th Street as an individual landmark pursuant to Section 911 of the Boulder Revised Code 1981 and under the proceeds prescribed by Chapter 1 through 3, Quasi-Judicial Hearings, Boulder Revised Code of 1981. The owner and applicants are Joseph and Caroline Holmes Stepanek. I'll hand it over to Claire for the staff presentations.
Great, thank you, Renee. So this is the same as 5A. It's a quasi-judicial hearing. So everybody speaking will be sworn in, and that includes me, and I affirm that I will tell the truth. Board members, again, please note any ex parte contacts you have.
I walked by the house this evening and checked it out from the public sidewalk and don't believe that will prohibit me from being partial and unbiased.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so hearing no others, I will move on to the staff presentation, and the process is the same. The applicants, Joe and Carolyn, are here, and they will have up to 10 minutes to present to the board, and then after that, we'll open the public hearing before the board deliberates. Again, the criteria for review is outlined in the Boulder Revised Code under 911.5C. And once again, this application came from the owners of the property, the hearing must be scheduled between 60 and 180 days. So we are here today after we received their application in April. Once again, the options are for the Landmarks Board to approve the application and recommend designation to City Council, or the board may disapprove the request. So here we are. The property at 844 to 850 12th Street is located mid-block between Aurora and Cascade Avenues on 12th Street. The property includes two structures. The primary house at 850 12th Street faces west onto 12th Street, and the accessory house, which is 844 12th Street, also faces west, but it's set back toward the alley. The property is located within the identified potential University Hill Historic District. This is 850 12th Street. It has a traditional setback from 12th Street. The house is brick and stucco. It was designed by architect David Hull Holmes and constructed in 1920. David Hull Holmes was a teacher at the Territorial University in Tucson, Arizona, which is now the University of Arizona. He designed many of the buildings in Tucson, and the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation credits David with creating Tucson's iconic southwestern Mediterranean style, featuring the thick stucco walls, deep overhangs, efficient ventilation and natural cooling, and Mediterranean styles and motifs without excess of ornamentation. And also, David Hull Holmes is the current owner, Carolyn's great granduncle. In 1917, David's brother and Carolyn's grandfather, Horace, who lived in Boulder, died suddenly. David returned to Boulder to support his extended family here. During the First World War and the flu epidemic, David served as the treasurer of the Boulder chapter of the Red Cross. He worked alongside Elizabeth Heilman, who was also a volunteer and was the publicity agent for the Red Cross. Elizabeth had purchased the lots, and she hired David to design her house. The house shares elements of David's signature Mediterranean style, including its horizontal form, exposed raft details, arched opening, stucco and divided light windows. However, the house is unique in its modest size and detailing that reflect Elizabeth's desires and probably also her budget. Elizabeth and her friend Kate, who was also a Red Cross volunteer, moved into 850 12th Street, which included a basement garage. The original garage doors were modified to make an entry by Joe and Carolyn in the 1960s, but back in the 1920s, it was a very modern idea to have an attached garage. During the Great Depression, Elizabeth rented out this house to Annie Dennis and her granddaughter Suzanne. Annie and Suzanne had a maid, Margaret P. Roberts, and a chauffeur, Sam Dawson, accompany them from Texas to live with them in this house. And as we continue to try to expand our knowledge of the Black community in Boulder's history, this house gives a unique perspective. While Annie, Suzanne, Margaret, and Sam lived in the front house, Elizabeth lived in the rear house, 844 12th Street. We don't know who Elizabeth hired to design or build the second house. Its frame, clad in painted wood shingle. Just like the front house, the building is 1 story at the facade and 2 story at the side and rear due to the topography of the site. And it also includes a garage in the basement. Elizabeth lived in this house as soon as it was completed in 1928 until her death in 1942. She rented out the front house while she lived here. In 1942, Grace and Florence Bedell purchased the property from Elizabeth Heilman's estate. Grace and Florence were sisters, both retired professionals. They spent the 1920s and 1930s teaching nutrition, chemistry of sanitation, emotional health in family life, textile care, and many other scientific subjects essential for families struggling through the Great Depression. Grace taught in Texas and Florence at the University of Colorado in Boulder. They both were professors of home economics. Both women were unmarried, which might seem odd, but remember that married women were required to resign from their career, and both sisters decided on a career. Grace and Florence lived in the rear house while they modernized the house at the front of the lot, and as far as we know, they made no changes to the smaller rear house, which includes the original paired casement multi-light windows and the stone chimney. Although we don't know the architect for this house, the symmetry of the windows and basic detailing shows care and skill in design. Staff analysis uses the Landmarks Board's 1975 significance criteria and also the National Park Service aspects of integrity to ensure the buildings retain the physical features that allow them to convey the significance. Staff found that both houses on the property meet the criteria for both significance and integrity. The house at the front, designed by architect David Hull Holmes, has changed over time as residents adapted it to their needs. But the house retains character-defining stucco, the arched entry at the facade, the multi-light windows in punched openings, and the stepped stone chimney. Staff found few changes to the exterior of 844 12th Street. The character-defining features of this house include the shingle cladding, the multi-light windows, the garage door, and the stepped stone chimney. The first owner, Elizabeth Heilman, was a key volunteer for Boulder's Red Cross during the First World War. Elizabeth bought lots 11 and 12, the two northernmost lots, in May 1919, and she commissioned fellow volunteer and architect David Hull Holmes to design and build 850 12th Street. She purchased the adjacent lot to the south, 844 12th Street, in 1923 and built the smaller house in 1927. She lived there until her death in 1942. Subsequently, Grace and Florence Bedell purchased the property. Grace and Florence were sisters, both retired professionals who had worked in the new field of home economics. Although not documented, these women, all three of them, undoubtedly saved many lives through their work, and the houses provide an opportunity for those stories to be told. The front house is constructed in the Southwest Mediterranean style. As I mentioned, the Tucson Historic Preservation Foundation credits David Hull Holmes with creating this iconic style in Tucson. The National Register nomination for 720 11th Street, the house that is named after David Hull Holmes in Boulder, notes that the house David designed at 850 12th Street in 1920 is in keeping with the white stucco-clad homes he designed during the latter part of his career in Tucson, notably for their clean, bold lines, deep roof overhangs, and stripped-down simplicity. We don't know the architect for the rear house, yet the symmetry of the windows and basic detailing shows care and skill in design. The streetcar was a major factor in the development of the neighborhood. Only about half of all lots in the University Place neighborhood were developed by 1920. And the 1920s saw a huge building boom in this neighborhood. While both are modest houses, they are both important visual landmarks within the neighborhood and along the alley, and tell the story of the area's 1920s development, in particular in the way they relate to one another. Staff recommends the property be known as the Heilman Bedell property to recognize the achievements of the original and subsequent longtime residents. The boundary would follow the property lines of the lot and include both houses. This boundary is supported by the property owners. Staff recommends that the Landmarks Board adopt the findings in the memo and recommend to City Council that it designate the property at 844 to 850 12th Street as a local historic landmark to be known as the Heilman Bedell property, finding that it meets the standards for individual landmark designation in sections 911.1 and 911.2 of the Boulder Revised Code. And staff findings are that the designation will protect, enhance, and perpetuate a property reminiscent of a past era of history and preserve an important example of Boulder's historic architecture. The proposed designation will maintain an appropriate setting and environment for the buildings and enhance property values, stabilize the neighborhood, promote tourist trade and interest, and foster knowledge of the city's living heritage. So a quick reminder of the next steps in the process. We'll ask Joe and Carolyn if they have anything to add, and then we'll move into public participation and then board deliberation. And once again, the options today are for the Landmarks Board to approve the application and recommend designation to City Council or recommend denial. Any questions?
I've got a criteria question. Does the fact that the house is in a potential historic district play a factor in the criteria? Or is that just of note?
Sure. So yeah, the question was, since the property is in a potential historic district, did that factor into our consideration for the analysis? And it does. The environmental significance criteria asks about area integrity. You know, what's the context of the property and the houses. So the potential historic district was identified in the early 90s. So We know that it at that time was potential and had quite a high degree of integrity at that time.
Okay, thanks. And then I'm a little less familiar with the naming convention for these. In looking at the owners, it seems like the Heilmans were significant, and of course, developing the property. The Bedells were there for a while, but I was curious why the Stepanek family that's had it since 1967. It seems like they played a pretty significant role. I was curious why it wasn't the Heilman Stepanek out property or just Heilman.
Yeah, great question. And it's up to the board. You're welcome to modify our recommended name and make your own recommendation. Our consideration, both with this one and the previous landmark, both have, very long ownership with the current owners who are nominating the properties. Where the Stoivas lived in that house for the last 55 years, the Stepaneks have owned this house but lived there for a short time in the 1960s. And the naming guidelines for landmarks kind of discourages naming it after the current owner unless they also have like a significant tie to the property. So we went back and forth on the name. I think there's a number of names that would be appropriate, including the ones you've suggested.
Thanks.
Any additional questions? We will move to the owner applicant presentation. And if you would please state your full name and swear to tell the truth. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. My name is Joe Stepanek, and I swear to tell the truth. Thank you for letting us speak to you. Thank you very much for all the work that's been put into this exercise. Thank you. Much, much appreciated. At the risk of wandering a little bit, there are elements to this application that I think are important. The house is very much Mediterranean style because David Hull Holmes spent the bulk of his career in Tucson. And so he introduced Mediterranean style into Boulder, which otherwise would be Eastern Seaboard, primarily in terms of its architectural orientation. I also would like to emphasize that University Hills it will someday soon be a historic district. And Chautauqua is a very special place in ways that Boulderites may not fully appreciate. My wife and I made a point of visiting the original Chautauqua in Western New York, wherein we were kind of alarmed to learn that it is a gated community. So Boulder's Chautauqua is an original Chautauqua, open to the public. And we can take great pride in that fact. And of course, our home is halfway between a historic Chautauqua and an equally famous university. And so we feel pleased to be where we are, walking distance to both. Another element to the story that I find intriguing is that right next door, next to 850, is 860. When we moved in, we found that a gentleman by the name of Ed Condon lived there. And Ed, at the time, had been the director of the Bureau of Standards in Washington, D.C. And Dr. Condon had convinced President Truman and President Eisenhower that we had too many of our key institutions on the East Coast, so close following World War II. He convinced these presidents to move the new bureau to Boulder. And so, very much by accident, my wife-to-be and I were in the crowd when President Eisenhower came to Boulder to cut the ribbon for the new bureau in 1954. And as they famously say, the rest is history, namely Colorado's Front Range is a heartland of incredible degree of research and development by professional people. And the university was the start of that with a great boost from the new bureau placed here in Boulder. So we're very proud to have been part of that story because as a child, I knew Ed Condon, not knowing how significant his own role had been in the creation of Boulder. And with that, I'm happy to say thank you. I answer questions, of course. We're very proud to still own the place, preserve it as is. Old houses take a little work, but we're very proud to be part of University Hill and hope that it's well preserved. We are anxious to preserve the two houses, even though they will soon be up for sale, because there are just too many houses like this one that are raised. And so our first motive was protection of the building. And the second motive is simply to enhance the historic nature of the whole hill area. We're very pleased to be part of that. So thank you again for your time. Happy to answer questions.
Thank you. What an interesting story.
Thank you.
I don't see any questions. We can now move on to public comment. Mariah, do we have any virtual attendees, please? And if you are virtual, make sure that you press *9 or raise your hand.
Do you want to start with in person?
In
or-
person.
Okay. First up is Tim Plass.
Tim Plass, Executive Director of Historic Boulder, and I swear to tell the truth. And I have to say, I really like these evenings that have owner-initiated hearings. They're very nice, and I hope that you will also move this owner-initiated request for landmarking forward to City Council. It's certainly worthy. And I want to thank the Stepanics for bringing this forward. Joe and Carolyn, they're longtime supporters of historic preservation and Historic Boulder, and very much appreciate that. And this property merits designation based on its architecture, the Southwest Mediterranean style, and for its association with architect David Hull Holmes, Elizabeth Heilman, the Bedells, I'd say the Stepanics as well. And again, I was just struck by how much interesting information there is that comes out about a property and the people who live there. Again, I hope that you will forward this to City Council with a request that it become a landmark. And I also would follow up on Board Member Weinheimer's idea that perhaps the Stepanics should be in the name of the house too. And I don't know if it should be the Heilman Bedell Stepanic House or something else, but I think that it is certainly worthwhile to consider that and to consider that they brought it forward for landmarking, which I think has a value as well. And I would say also, just from the two hearing items this evening, we get a great sense of how much really worthwhile architecture there is on the Hill that's not protected yet. So many great historic resources, and I hope this is the beginning of protection of more of those. I mean, the National Register eligible historic district is really large. So hopefully this is the beginning of more protection for our great historic resources. And again, thank you to Joe and Carolyn.
Next up, we have Catherine Barth.
Good evening again, Catherine. So just state your name and where.
Catherine Barth. That's it. And I
And
will
you're-
tell the truth. Carolyn's mother was one of the first people I met when I moved to Boulder in 1989. And she called me and she introduced herself and she said, I need some help. And I've heard that you know something about historic buildings. And I said, well, I don't know anybody in town, but I'd be very happy to talk to you. And so it was Carolyn's mom, who was one of the major first people to be interested in saving the bandshell. And so she just grabbed me into her nice aura, and I have been a proponent of the bandshell ever since. But Carolyn comes from a very civic-minded family, with her dad, who was the judge, and her mother, who was the second president of Historic Boulder. So she and Joe are following in their family tradition, and I'm very happy that these houses will be protected, because there are a lot of houses that are being, I guess, targeted by developers or people who might want to tear them down. And these houses are part of what now Boulder, I think, is doing, asking people to provide affordable housing. I mean, here are 2 small houses on 1 lot, and this is what you can do now in neighborhoods. You can add another residence or an ADU. They were called ADUs. I guess they can just be residences now. But so I think this property was kind of ahead of its time, and it was providing multiple family housing. So I really commend Carolyn and Joe for bringing it forward, and I hope you will support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any virtual attendees?
If you'd like, oh, we've got one. Lynn Siegel.
And Lynn, just make sure you state your full name and swear to tell the truth as you know it.
Lynn Siegel, and I swear to tell the truth as I know it. I don't remember, Joe, if I've been in this house. I've been in yours and Carolyn's house decades ago up on Chautauqua, but I don't know. I don't remember if it was this one. But in any case, I also have a name recommendation, and I really do not think this house should go without the name Holmes on it. I mean, that's Carolyn's maiden name, and it's David, and he was the architect that drew this influence of the Mediterranean, and I don't understand why he shouldn't be like in the middle between the 2 names. And Stepanek, I think, I mean, it's the married name of the Holmes. And if you're concerned about landmarking something in someone's name that's still living there, then fine with that, but it shouldn't go without Holmes, I wouldn't think. But that's just me, maybe. And like Catherine said, I really like the idea of the multi-family situation and hearing about the history of the academics and the home ec sisters that lived in there. And it's just really eclectic and neat. And I was so glad that someone at least brought up Judge Holmes' name, because up in Mapleton, where I live on the margin of Mapleton on the north, there's the Holmes, Judge Holmes house, where I guess that was Carolyn's mother was the wife of Judge Holmes, I'm presuming, and grew up there. And that's something I go by all the time on 6th Street. It's just interesting how these 2 landmarking applications came up tonight that have these associations in the neighborhood, the 2 neighborhoods. I guess that's not uncommon because this is an academic community, but the other one with the Tudor background, and Judy Reed and Richard Collins, and they were with Native American Rights Fund. And then down the street on 6th was the other guy, I can't think of his name now, but on the street where David Getchie's from the law school, and Richard Collins was in the law school. So there's all these connections, and it's just one of the eclectic things about Boulder that's pretty neat. So
Thank
yeah.
you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. The owner may now have 3 additional minutes if they would like to respond to anything that was said during public comment. Thank you.
Before we begin deliberation, can I ask a question to the applicant?
Yeah, but the applicant must come up to the diocese.
Do you guys have any opposition to the name Holmes or Stepanek being involved in the name of the landmark?
We would be very pleased to have one or both would be fine.
Do you have a preference between the two?
I've married into the Holmes family. Very pleased to add Holmes. I have Holmes on my personal calling card. Holmes Stepanek. I share my calling card with my spouse. Had the good sense to marry the judge's daughter, so it'd be nice to have both names. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now that we move on to the board discussions, I ask that everyone please mute your computer or phone for the duration of the discussion. Does anybody want to kick off on the discussion?
I can go.
Okay.
This is a lovely property to see from the street. It's rather unsuspecting, seeing just a single story, very simple design, and then it plays nicely into the hillside with the second floor of the main house. And then the house in the back of the light is quite literally camouflage, both with trees and then the color that it's painted. You see the steps sort of leading to it well before you see the entire house. So just felt like a really well designed lot. I'm in support of landmarking both homes and the entire parcel as recommended by staff. I would be interested in swapping out the Bedell name on the name of the landmark for either Holmes or Stepanek.
I think maybe can we address the name as a separate thing, and
we
then
should.
Since my microphone is on, I concur with everything that was just said. I mean, it's easy to support landmarking the sort of bigger houses, but when you find sort of these delicate little small scale properties, and it may look plain at first sight, but the restraint in detailing is immaculate. I mean, it's got beautiful street presence. I love this house, and I'm in support. And after we talk about the architecture, I'm also interested in talking about the name. But one quick clarification: in the proposed name that we saw in, I think, the proposed language, it's not house, it's something property, right? Okay.
Okay. I do think that the name issue is brought up. I think we should just agree on something here. I don't necessarily like the idea of swapping names. I'm not sure why Bedell gets demoted off of the house completely. Just string the names out. Bedell, Holmes, Stepanek, something like that.
Are we talking about the names now?
Well, yeah, I thought we were going to settle the names.
We were going to talk about the architecture first.
Oh,
and
oh,
then
the
We were
architecture.
going to talk about the names.
Okay,
You were just going to are you in support or?
I'm in support. I'm in support. As far as the architecture goes, I really think that the kind of Tucson glimpse that was brought to this property is very interesting to me. There's a few other kind of like Spanish revival tile roof buildings around, but they're more like the Midwestern versions than the actual Western versions that you see. And so this is actually a fairly unique example of something vernacular to the West that appeared in Boulder. And so it even further increases the worthiness of this property to be designated. It's refreshing, and again, I feel almost honored that we get to participate in this type of thing, where the owners who have taken great care of these properties bring them for designation, and we get to experience that process in this way. So I think that the interesting thing also about this property in terms of architecture and utility is the fact that you had this kind of ADU-like development at this early time, which was common in this part of the country, and that later codes and zoning kind of negated, that is now becoming popular again because of the need for housing. And so this is just it's a delightful thing to be able to review a project like this and confirm the designation that the owners have already decided is required. So I support it, and I also support the issue of the name when we get to that.
I just want to add one thing, because you sent my architectural sort of categorization into its own little rabbit hole. And I think it was Joseph who mentioned that so much of the revival, Mediterranean revival, is attributed to the East Coast, and this is coming from an opposite direction. And I think it's worth noting that very particularly. I mean, we have one of the greatest examples of, and maybe a singular example in the university, in a very European-based revival architecture, where here I mean, it's just important to point that out, that this is something that is sort of more west, more plains, if you will, as opposed to coastal. And that's an important ingredient, I think, in the description of the architecture, and in that there's a nuance, but it is a separate and maybe a singular example on its own right of that particular revival styling, and a great one, and a really good one. And I think that's what, when I spoke of restraint, I really kind of mean from that legacy, that it honors that pretty well. So I'll be quiet.
I just want to thank the owners for bringing forth this house, and these houses. I really think it's interesting that, at first you take a look at it, and it, like Michael was saying, it's not this big, huge structure that we're used to designating, but I just find that it's almost more important that we take on these little pieces, and that we keep the history and these little gems throughout, that they might not be something that we would normally think of as Boulder architecture, but I think that's why it makes it so much more important. So, because at first I was like, oh, look at this little house, so different at the beginning. And then the whole story comes out, and how interesting that story was, and how we get to now hopefully preserve the story of these two residents. So I want to thank you for that. And I'm excited to always hear about how Claire puts together these presentations, and how we get to learn a little bit more of the history and the reason why we actually love living in Boulder. So, and then on the name thing, I'm interested to talk about it. What I was just thinking about is, could we, it's a property designation, but is there a way to put, because, the first architect, he did the house that we keep talking about, the Mediterranean looking house on the left, right? And then the two other women, not knowing the architect, but they did that one. So could we split and name the houses instead? The different names?
Can we ask Chelsea if she has an opinion about the architecture?
Chelsea, would you like to weigh in?
I think you all covered it. I agree with you all and the staff recommendation to approve this as designated. And interested to hear what you all think about the name. I think for me, while I'm unmuted, I think it's great to expand the opportunity to include more people in the naming of the property. So I think the more the merrier.
this won't come as a surprise, but I have a strong opinion about the name. And I think this one is tricky because the name Holmes, if it's being attributed to the architect, which is actually, if you think about it, kind of odd, right? I mean, how many Frank Lloyd Wright houses would there be with the Frank Lloyd Wright name associated with them in their name? And they're not, except for those that he lived in. So I think it's a slippery slope to include the architect's name in a designation, particularly when the designation is about a property. It's confirmed that he was part of one piece of it, but not potentially the other. And I know we're also talking about there's potentially a hyphenated ownership name that is the same. So to me, that it just needs to be really clear which homes we're talking about in the name, if that's a path we go down. And I would not advocate for the homes that is as much as I think all the buildings that I designed should have my name associated with them. But I just don't think it's appropriate for the architect's name to be associated with the name of this designated property. Marcy's looking at me like, you're wrong, Michael, but.
Well, no, I appreciate Alex's question earlier about the criteria. So I'd like to dust off the criteria, which was adopted in 1989, and just maybe go over it again, because there's so many right answers, very few wrong answers. So the guidelines for names of landmark structures and sites. The purpose is for the Landmarks Board finds the adoption of the guideline for the official landmark names of structures and site designated as by the City Council will provide consistency in meeting the historic preservation goals as set forth in the Historic Preservation Code. So the criteria is that the official landmark name of the site or structure should be based on one or more of the following criteria. A, the original owners, architect, or builder. B, historically significant persons or prominent long-term residents. C, a commonly accepted name. D, original or later event or use. E, an unusual or architectural characteristic which clearly identifies the landmarks. And F, the contributions of both men and women. And then it goes on to say owners requesting landmark designation for their buildings may be considered under the above criteria. In the event that the official landmark name does not include the present owners, a separate plat containing the statement landmark designation applied for by so-and-so will be made available at the owner's expense. So wanted to offer that as guidance.
Can you just remind us what you've chosen?
So
sorry.
So our recommended name was the Heilman Bedell property based on the significance of two of the owners. You could also do Holmes, Heilman, Bedell, Stepanek, which kind of covers from the beginning to the end of that. Holmes being the architects, Stepanek being the long-term and current owners.
My 2 cents is to leave it as is, but because I like it how it's just the first owner on the one house and then it's the first owner on the house on the right. Right? And they built the one on the right.
I think they just lived in it.
I think Bedell was 42 to 59, and then the second house was built. When was 844 built?
1928.
And then who built, who was the first person to live in that house?
Elizabeth Heilman actually lived in that house.
Oh.
She lived in that when the main house was built. So the Heilman seemed to be significant in the establishment of the property. Looks like there's a family, some various tenants, and the Bedells were there for 17 years. Then a couple more owners, and then the Stepanek family took over in 67, rented it out from 71 to 96. So the Stepanek family's been there 2-3 times longer than the Bedells. And the Bedells didn't have as much involvement in the development of the property as the Heilman. So I think Heilman's a pretty critical part of establishing the property, and then Holmes or Stepanek would be a good way of honoring the longest term resident and those
Well,
landmark.
owner, they
Owner.
didn't live there.
They've been there since 96.
Well, they didn't live there. Then they lived.
From 71 to 96. I think it was rented out is what the memo said.
Oh, at 96, they rented it out.
They bought it in
70 to
67,
Oh.
lived there briefly, rented it from 71 to 96, and then have been there since 96. So 35 plus years, whereas Bedell's were there for 17.
I was just thinking about the people who've lived in the property the longest, like instead of owning it and renting it out. I know there's still like a lot of ownership. They've done a lot to preserve it. So I want to honor that rather than, you know, like if we want to add that name. I'm also good with just having it be the Heilman property.
Heilman alone made more sense to me than Heilman Bedell. The Stepaneks made more sense than Bedell, and to what Marcy said earlier, I think it makes some sense not to name something after a current owner, but if it sounds like they're not going to be owning it in the near future, I think that's less of a consideration.
I think that I'm going to be fine with however this is resolved, but I think it would be interesting to do it as Heilman Stepanek, and then that marks the beginning and the current time, and captures everything in between without specific reference. And that would be one way to do this. It seems like this property has an interesting kind of resonance because of its uniqueness. It attracts people that turn out to be significant in the community. So it's harder to name that based on just the criteria, because every name associated with this house, it sounds like satisfies one of the criteria in some way, or could be argued to satisfy at least one of them. And we could name it all of them, but then so that's my suggestion, is to go Heilman Stepanek et al.
Do we decide that here or?
Somebody make a motion.
Yeah, it has to be a motion.
Yeah, it'll be in your recommendation to council.
Okay.
Wouldn't it be in the motion language?
In the main motion language.
So we can just update this with whatever you
Do we have,
choose.
do we have consensus on
Yeah,
that?
do we want to do a straw poll on?
I
some
like
names?
your suggestion, and because the owners were fine with either Stepanek or Holmes, fine with either.
Okay. Does this have to be moved and voted, or do we?
It does, but for the straw poll purposes, I'm in support of that. I mean, again, as an architect, you like to see, and we have a certain amount of ego, you like to see your name associated with properties, but I think the right thing here is those that kind of procured it, initiated it, and have cared for it. I feel a little iffy about the Bedells were the two sisters,
Yeah.
right? To Chelsea's point,
Yeah. You might want to keep them in it.
I mean,
I
guess-
just like the history of their, like the story and how they lived there and what they brought to Boulder. And I don't want to lose that, you know, because like when you go up to the house,
Yeah.
there's a, like, you know, you're like, oh, who are those people? And who was that people? And who are these, you know, and then there's like a storyline that you can Google or find out about it where, you know, so I like that idea of it naming that, because then they still get a little bit of,
I can make a motion.
great.
The Landmarks Board recommends to the City Council that it designate the property at 844-850 12th Street as a local historic landmark to be known as the Heilman Bedell Stepanek property, finding that it meets the standards for individual landmark designation in sections 9-11-1 and 9-11-2 BRC 1981, and adopt the staff memorandum dated July 1st, 2026 as the findings of the board.
I'll second that.
Thank you, Michael. And Alex seconds it. We'll do a roll call vote. Michael,
Aye.
John,
Aye.
Chelsea,
Aye.
Alex,
Aye.
and I vote aye. The motion passes unanimously. Claire, can you please go over the next steps in the process?
I can. Thank you. We'll forward the application to City Council, and they'll have a public hearing within 100 days. And if all goes well, they are the final decision makers, but they hopefully will designate the property, and we'll work on making the plaque. And thank you for your time today. Really appreciate you being here.
Let's move to matters. Back to you, Marcy.
All right, and we'll keep it short. This is more of a call to board members. We usually hold an annual retreat. It's usually an afternoon on a Friday, sometime between now and the end of the year. So if you all could respond individually to staff of one, if you're interested in holding a retreat, and two, what potential topics you might be interested in discussing, that can be an email. That's the end of this matters update.
Okay.
Let's see. What do I have to say? Meeting is adjourned at 7:34.
A record.
I get it.
It's not a
Uh-oh.
record.
Oh, he just has to say goodbye. It's like, oh, we got in trouble.
No, you're good. Go USA. Michael's gonna drive. Don't drive too fast, Michael.
Okay, can I say
If
something
you're
to
for
you guys?
Serbo-Croatian.
I don't want to